No land on Earth was conquered more often than this one, and almost none of it shows in the blood. To understand why that is strange, you first have to understand what this land once was. 2,500 years ago, a Persian king named Cyrus built the largest empire the world had ever seen, a realm that reached from the edge of India to the shores of the Aegean, from the deserts of Egypt to the cold rivers of Central Asia. For 2 centuries, the Persian kings ruled more of humanity than anyone before them, bound together by roads so well engineered that a royal messenger could cross a continent in a week. This was not some quiet corner that happened to get trampled. For a time, Persia was the center of the world, which is exactly why the world kept coming for it, and why once its own golden age had passed, the armies never seemed to stop. Stand for a moment on the Iranian plateau and count the armies that have crossed it. Alexander of Macedon burned its capital and called himself its king. 700 years later, the armies of a new faith rode out of Arabia and in a single generation ended an empire that had stood for 4 centuries. Then came the Turks out of the eastern steppe and took the throne. Then came the Mongols, and the Mongols did not just conquer Persia, they emptied whole cities of every living soul. 4 times at least the sky fell on this country. 4 times a foreign banner flew over its ruins. Each conqueror rewrote the language on the coins, the god in the temples, and the name of the land itself. And then, in our own century, geneticists did something none of those armies could do. They read the actual sequence written in the blood of the people who live there now. They were looking for the fingerprints of all those conquests, the Greek soldiers, the Arab armies, the Turkish horsemen, the Mongol hordes. That is what the history books promised they would find. A crossroads, a palimpsest, a people written over so many times that the original text was lost. That is not what they found. What they found was a thread of ancestry so old and so stubborn that it runs, almost unbroken, past every one of those catastrophes, down through the fall of empires and the burning of cities, and comes to rest on a single woman. She lived about 10,000 years ago in a village in the Zagros mountains, and she kept goats. She had no idea she was the beginning of anything. But most of what it means genetically to be Persian today traces back not to Alexander, not to the caliphs, not to the Aryan horsemen of legend, but to her and to the people she herded her goats among, before there was writing, before there were kings, before there was Persia at all. So here is the question that ought to unsettle you the way it unsettled the people who first saw it in the data. How does the most conquered land in the world end up with one of the least conquered genomes? How do you get run over by half the empires in history and stay, in the blood, almost exactly who you were before any of them arrived? Keep that question in your mind, because everything that follows is the slow uncovering of a single secret. And the secret is not who conquered Persia. The secret is what conquest could not touch. Let us begin with the 2 stories Persians tell about themselves, because both of them are about to break. The first story is the noble one. It is the story of the Aryans. For more than a century, Iranian identity has been built around a single word, the word that gives the country its very name. Iran means land of the Aryans. The story says that in some deep past, a race of noble horsemen swept down onto the plateau from the northern grasslands, bringing their language, their gods and their blood, and that the Persians are their pure descendants. It is a story of arrival and of purity, of a people who came from somewhere magnificent and stayed magnificent. The second story is the opposite, and it comes from outside. It is the lazy story the rest of the world tells, that Iran is simply part of the Middle East, one more nation in a region the maps color a single shade. Neighbors of the Arabs, cousins of the Gulf. Middle Eastern, and therefore the assumption goes more or less the same as everyone else in that corner of the world. One story says Persians are a pure people who arrived from the steppe. The other says they are indistinguishable from the region around them. And when geneticists finally sequenced the Iranian population at scale over 1,000 people from 11 different ethnic groups across the country, they discovered that both stories are wrong. Not slightly wrong, wrong at the root. To see why, we have to go back to the goat-herding woman, because everything begins with her. In the Zagros mountains of western Iran, there is a site called Ganj Dareh, the Valley of Treasure. 10,000 years ago, it was one of the very first places on Earth where human beings stopped chasing their food and started keeping it. A village of early herders, among the first anywhere to raise goats. In 2016, a team of scientists managed to pull a whole genome out of the remains of a woman who had lived and died there. And when they read her DNA, they got a genuine shock. She did not look like the farmers of Anatolia to the west, the people who would carry agriculture into Europe. She did not look like anyone who had contributed much to the European story at all. She belonged to a lineage that had been separate, isolated in these mountains for a staggeringly long time, tens of thousands of years of its own private history. The scientists gave that lineage a name: Iranian Neolithic ancestry. A deep, distinct, homegrown root native to the plateau that owed nothing to anyone who came later. And here is the part that should stop you. When the researchers asked which people alive today most resemble that 10,000-year-old woman, the answer was not some scattered remnant. It was the Iranians. Above all, it was the Iranian Zoroastrians, the followers of the old pre-Islamic faith, who carried her signature most purely of all. The goat herder of the Zagros was not a stranger to modern Persia. She was its oldest surviving cell. Now, hold that root in your mind, because we are about to add the layer that everyone mistakes for the whole story. The Aryans were real. That much the genetics confirms. Somewhere around 4,000 years ago in the Bronze Age, a new kind of ancestry began seeping onto the Iranian plateau from the north and the east, carried by peoples out of the Great Eurasian Steppe, the same restless horse and wagon cultures whose descendants would spread a family of languages from Ireland to India. They brought the tongue that would become Persian. They brought a mythology. They gave the land its name. In every sense that a historian cares about, they matter enormously. But the geneticists could now measure exactly how much of the actual blood they brought, and the number is humbling. In the modern Iranian genome, that steppe ancestry, the true genetic signature of the Aryans, accounts for only around 15%. The single largest component, by far, is still the old Neolithic and Copper Age farmer ancestry of the plateau itself, well over 70% in most Iranians. The horsemen of legend did not replace the people they found. They married into them. They handed over a language and a name and a set of gods, and then they dissolved as a minority into a population that was already ancient when they arrived. So the noble Aryan myth breaks on its own arithmetic. Persians are not the pure children of steppe conquerors. They are overwhelmingly the children of the goat-herding woman and her kind, with a 15% gift of language riding on top. The most Persian thing about a Persian, genetically, is the part that was here before the Persians had a name. Which brings us to the conquests. Because if the founding Aryan layer barely moved the needle, what did all the empires do? Consider what this plateau endured. In 330 before the Common Era, Alexander swept in, defeated the mighty Achaemenid Persia, and burned Persepolis, the ceremonial capital, to the ground. For a century afterward, Greek kings ruled the land. Greek was the language of the court, and Greek soldiers settled in colonies across the east. Then, 1,000 years later, in the 7th century, the armies of Islam met the Sasanian Empire, the last great Persian dynasty, 400 years old, and shattered it in a handful of catastrophic battle. The fire temples went cold. Arabic became the language of scripture and scholarship. The very idea of Persia seemed, for a time, to have ended. It did not end. And in the 11th century came the Seljuk Turks, sweeping down from Central Asia to rule the plateau under a new dynasty and a new elite. And then in the 13th century came the worst of all. The Mongols under Genghis Khan and his heirs did not merely conquer Iran in cities that resisted, they carried out slaughter on a scale that is hard to comprehend, killing hundreds of thousands, in some accounts more than 1 million, and leaving the great cities of the northeast as fields of rubble and bone. If any invasion should have rewritten the genome of a people, it was that one. Greek, Arab, Turk, Mongol. 4 waves, each one certain in its moment that it had made the land its own. And there was a strange aftertaste to it all, a clue hiding in plain sight. Look at what the conquests actually left behind. The Arabs ruled Persia for centuries, and their language, Arabic, is a Semitic tongue, a cousin of Hebrew. Yet the Persian spoken on the plateau today is not Semitic at all. It is Indo-European, a distant relative of Greek, of Latin, of English, the inheritance of those Bronze Age steppe horsemen who were only ever a fraction of the ancestry. A people can be ruled for 1,000 years by speakers of one language family and still, in their own mouths, keep another. If the tongue could survive all of that intact, the question is, what else did? And the blood is a far older record than the tongue. So the geneticists went looking for them in the blood, and in 2025 a team sequenced ancient DNA spanning 3,000 years of the northern Iranian plateau, from the Copper Age through the rise and fall of the Persian empires all the way down to the Sasanian era on the eve of the Arab conquest. 3,000 years of samples laid end to end through the exact centuries when all those armies came and went. They were braced for turbulence. What they found instead was a straight line. Genetic continuity, the same core population, the same deep ancestry, carried forward across 3,000 years and through every one of those upheavals with only modest disturbance. The conquerors changed the language on the coins and the god in the temples and the name of the ruling house. They did not in any deep way change the people. The blood on the plateau in the age of the Sasanians was, in its essentials, the blood of the goat herders, the same thread, unbroken, that ran back to Ganj Dareh. How is that possible? How do you get conquered 4 times and stay yourself? The answer is not that Persia kept the conquerors out. It is the opposite. Persia let them in and outlasted them. The Greek soldiers who settled became a thin Greek-speaking layer that faded within generations. The Arab armies were, in raw numbers, a fraction of the vast population they ruled. The plateau took their religion and their alphabet and gave back, within 2 centuries, a renaissance of Persian poetry and science conducted in a Persian language written in Arabic script. The Turks and the Mongols came as ruling elites, a few tens of thousands of warriors astride a nation of millions, and within a few generations their descendants were speaking Persian, patronizing Persian art and being absorbed genetically into the sea of people they had set out to rule. Every conquest was real. Every conquest was, in the end, digested. And this is where the second story, the lazy one, the just another Middle Eastern country story, breaks as cleanly as the first. When that large genetic survey placed Iranians against their neighbors, they did not blur into the region around them. They stood apart. Iranians proved to be distinct, carrying that deep, homegrown Neolithic root that sets them off from the Arabian Peninsula, from Anatolia, from the peoples the maps lump them with. The study's own word for it was striking. The Iranian ethnic groups had developed autochthonously from the ground up in place, with limited genetic influx over several millennia, despite sitting on one of the busiest crossroads in the entire human world. Not Arab, not the pure Aryan of the myth. Something older and more singular than either label allows, a people continuous with the first farmers of their own mountains. There is one last piece, and it is the most poignant of all. Remember that the Zoroastrians, the keepers of the old faith, the religion of Persia before Islam, carried the ancient Ganj Dareh signature most purely of anyone. When the Arab conquest came, some Zoroastrians fled east to India rather than convert, and their descendants there, the Parsis, married almost entirely within their own community for 1,000 years. And when geneticists tested them, they found that the Parsis of India resembled the 10,000-year-old DNA of Neolithic Iran even more closely than the Iranians who stayed behind. A community that left Persia to save its religion accidentally became a living museum of Persian blood, the oldest copy of the plateau's genome, sealed and carried into exile, kept intact by the very faith the conquest tried to erase. So let us return to the question we began with. How does the most conquered land on Earth end up with one of the least conquered genomes? Because conquest, it turns out, is not the same thing as replacement. An empire can take your capital, your language, your gods and your name and still not take the thing written in the blood, not if the people it conquers are too many, too rooted and too old to be washed away. The armies came and the armies ruled, and the armies, one after another, dissolved into the population they thought they had defeated. Alexander is dust. The caliphs are dust. The Seljuk sultans and the Mongol khans are dust. And the goat-herding woman of the Zagros is still here in the faces on the streets of Tehran and Shiraz and Isfahan, in the Zoroastrian keeping the fire in the Parsi 10,000 miles away in Mumbai, who carries her signature most faithfully of all. That is the code written in Persian blood, not the myth of a pure race that arrived from somewhere magnificent. Not the shrug of a region painted a single color on a map. Something harder and far more remarkable, a genome that was conquered by everyone and belonged in the end to no one but itself. A people who did not survive by keeping the world out, but by taking the whole world in over and over for 10,000 years and remaining unmistakably themselves. Every empire that crossed this land was certain it had won. The blood remembers a different verdict.